Kelly Ann Bates. On April 16, 1996, James Patterson Smith walked into a police station in Greater Manchester and reported that his girlfriend had accidentally drowned. Officers responded to his Furnivall Road address in Gorton, expecting a tragic domestic accident. What they discovered instead defied comprehension. The body of Kelly Ann Bates, 17 years old, showed over 150 separate injuries. The scene shocked investigators who had handled countless cases throughout their careers. Detective Sergeant Joseph Monahan later stated, "I have been in the police force for 15 years and have never seen a case as horrific as this," a sentiment that would be echoed throughout the investigation. Blood evidence appeared throughout the residence, telling a story of prolonged suffering. But who was Kelly Ann Bates? And how had she ended up in this situation? Born May 18, 1978, in Hattersley, Kelly was described as an outgoing teenager with a part-time job and close family ties. Her parents, Margaret and Tommy Bates, knew their daughter as cheerful and social. Everything changed when she met James Patterson Smith while babysitting for mutual friends in 1993. Smith, born around 1948, was an unemployed divorcee with a documented history of concerning behavior toward former partners. By 1995, Kelly had moved into Smith's home, keeping the full nature of their relationship hidden from her parents due to the significant difference in their ages. Her family noticed she became increasingly isolated, missing family gatherings and making excuses when questioned. Margaret Bates would later recall, "As soon as I saw Smith, the hairs on the back of my neck went up," describing her immediate unease upon meeting him. The final 4 weeks of Kelly's life unfolded at Smith's residence in early 1996. Forensic examination revealed the extensive nature of her suffering through burns, stabbings with various implements, crush injuries, and severe weight loss of approximately 20 kilograms due to deprivation. Pathologist William Lawler, who had examined approximately 600 cases throughout his career, noted these were the most extensive injuries he had encountered. The medical examiner's report documented injuries to nearly every part of her body, showing a pattern of escalating cruelty over the weeks. Blood evidence throughout the residence indicated she had been moved between rooms during her ordeal, suggesting Smith maintained some level of calculated control rather than acting in sudden rage. How had no one intervened during this time? The isolation Smith imposed proved devastatingly effective. Neighbors reported occasional sounds, but nothing that prompted intervention. Kelly had no contact with family or friends during these final weeks. Smith controlled all aspects of her existence within the house, creating a prison from which she could not escape. The final act occurred in a bathtub, where Kelly drowned after head trauma from being struck with a shower head. Smith's decision to report the incident led to his immediate arrest once officers assessed the scene. His claim of an accidental drowning during an argument collapsed under the weight of forensic evidence documenting weeks of calculated acts. Investigation revealed Smith's troubling history. He had previously been involved in incidents with former partners Tina Watson and Wendy Mottershead, including attempts to drown them. The pattern suggested escalation rather than an isolated incident. Why had these warning signs not prevented Kelly's tragedy? The 1997 trial at Manchester Crown Court proved extraordinarily difficult for everyone involved. Jurors required counseling after viewing photographic evidence of Kelly's condition. Prosecutor Peter Openshaw described the acts as representing sustained and calculated cruelty. Smith offered a defense claiming Kelly had provoked him, stating, "She put me through hell winding me up," and suggesting she had harmed herself to frame him. Psychiatric evaluation by Dr. Gillian Mazie found Smith suffered from paranoid disorder and pathological jealousy, though these conditions did not constitute a legal defense. The jury deliberated and returned a guilty verdict on November 19, 1997. James Patterson Smith was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 20 years. However, Smith died in prison on May 17, 2024, at the age of 76, having never been granted parole due to his continued status as a highly dangerous person. Kelly was laid to rest at Mottram Cemetery. Her parents became advocates for recognizing warning signs in relationships marked by control and isolation. The case highlighted how predators can exploit young people's trust and gradually separate them from protective support systems. While that tragedy unfolded behind closed doors in England, an even more prolonged nightmare was occurring halfway across the world. Junko Furuta. In November 1988, Junko Furuta, a high-achieving high school senior in Misato, Saitama, Japan, was cycling home from her part-time job at a plastic factory. The 17-year-old had her life planned out: graduation, a trip with classmates, and employment at an electronics company. She never made it home that night. What happened next would shock Japan and expose dark corners of its juvenile justice system. On November 25, 1988, Hiroshi Miyano, an 18-year-old with connections to Yakuza elements, orchestrated Junko's abduction. He enlisted 3 accomplices: Joe Ogura, 17, Shinji Minato, 16, and Yasushi Watanabe, 17. These young men operated on the fringes of organized crime as chinpira, low-level associates seeking status through intimidation. Born January 18, 1971, Junko was known among peers and teachers at Yashio Minami High School as cheerful, diligent, and well-liked. She balanced academics with work, saving money for her planned future. Her family described a typical teenager with dreams and ambitions. The randomness of her selection as a target made the case even more disturbing. The group initially held Junko in various locations before eventually confining her in Minato's family home in Adachi. How could she be held for 40 days in a residence where others lived? Minato's parents were present, but claimed they feared their son and his associates, a claim that generated significant controversy during investigations. Their failure to intervene or contact authorities became a focal point of public outrage. The perpetrators forced Junko to call her family and claim she had run away, preventing a missing person investigation from developing urgency. This deception bought them time and freedom to continue their acts. Police resources that might have been deployed to search for Junko were instead diverted elsewhere. Believing she had chosen to leave home voluntarily, her parents lived with anguish during those 40 days, hoping she would return while having no idea of the horror she endured. During her captivity, over 100 individuals participated in assaults against Junko, a staggering number that raised questions about collective responsibility and bystander behavior. What drives not just 4 primary perpetrators, but scores of others to participate in such acts? Junko's captivity ended on January 4, 1989, when she died from her injuries. The perpetrators placed her body in a 55-gallon drum, filled it with concrete, and disposed of it in a reclaimed lot in Koto, Tokyo. They believed the concrete would prevent discovery and identification. The case broke through an unexpected route. In January 1989, Miyano and Ogura were arrested for a separate incident involving assault. During questioning about that case, they confessed to Junko's abduction and provided information leading to the recovery of her remains. The concrete drum was excavated, and forensic examination confirmed the horrific nature of her final weeks. Dental records identified Junko, and pathology reports documented the extensive nature of her suffering. The medical evidence presented at trial proved so disturbing that even hardened legal professionals struggled to maintain composure. How could the human body endure such prolonged trauma? The trial proceedings sparked national debate about juvenile justice. Because all 4 main perpetrators were under 18 at the time of the crimes, they were processed through juvenile court. Miyano received a sentence of 20 years, later reduced to 17. The others received sentences ranging from 5 to 9 years. Public outcry over these sentences led to reforms in Japanese juvenile justice law, though many felt the changes came too late for Junko. The perceived leniency sparked protests outside courthouses and generated ongoing discussion about whether juvenile protections should apply to such extreme offenses. Legal scholars debated the balance between rehabilitation potential and societal protection, with Junko's case frequently cited as evidence that some acts warrant adult consequences regardless of perpetrator age. Minato's mother reportedly vandalized Junko's grave, blaming her for ruining her son's life, an act that compounded the family's grief with additional insult. The Furuta family maintained dignity throughout the ordeal, focusing on remembering their daughter rather than seeking revenge. All 4 original perpetrators were released by 2005. Notably, Joe Kamisaku, formerly Ogura, reoffended in 2004, assault. And Hiroshi Yokoyama, formerly Miyano, was arrested again in 2013 for fraud, reinforcing the massive public and legal debate regarding the failure of their rehabilitation under juvenile laws. From Japan to the American Midwest, where another teenager would face unimaginable circumstances. Sylvia Likens. In October 1965, Indianapolis police received a call about an injured girl at a residence on New York Street. When officers arrived, they found 16-year-old Sylvia Likens deceased. The investigation would reveal months of sustained cruelty that shocked a community and exposed failures in oversight and intervention. What had transpired in that seemingly ordinary house? Sylvia Marie Likens, born January 3, 1949, was the third of 5 children to carnival workers Lester and Betty Likens. The transient nature of carnival work meant the family moved frequently. In July 1965, when the parents secured extended work, they arranged for Sylvia and her younger sister Jenny to board with Gertrude Banaszewski, an acquaintance, for $20 weekly. Gertrude Nadine Banaszewski, born September 19, 1929, lived in a small house with her 7 children. She struggled financially after divorcing her husband and dealt with health issues including depression and asthma. The additional income from boarding the Likens girls seemed necessary, but the arrangement would prove catastrophic. Initially, the situation appeared manageable. Sylvia and Jenny attended school and adjusted to their temporary home. Problems began when payment arrived late, though accounts differ on whether this truly triggered Gertrude's behavior or merely provided a rationalization. Gertrude began targeting Sylvia specifically, possibly due to jealousy over Sylvia's youth and appearance, or perceived slights that existed more in Gertrude's mind than reality. The situation escalated throughout the summer and fall of 1965. Gertrude enlisted her children and neighborhood youths in tormenting Sylvia. What started as confinement progressed to various forms of physical harm. Jenny, who had mobility limitations due to polio, witnessed the escalation but faced threats preventing her from seeking help. Why did none of the neighborhood children who witnessed these acts report them to adults? Multiple youths from the area entered the Banaszewski home and participated in harming Sylvia. The group dynamic created a situation where individual responsibility diffused across participants, each perhaps believing their specific actions were minor compared to others. Gertrude justified the treatment by spreading false stories about Sylvia's behavior, creating a narrative that some participants accepted as legitimizing their actions. In the final weeks, Sylvia was confined to the basement, deprived of adequate food and water, and subjected to continued trauma. On October 26, 1965, she died from a combination of factors, including shock, malnutrition, and her injuries. Gertrude attempted to construct a story claiming Sylvia had run away and been attacked by a gang, even having one of her sons draft a false note supposedly written by Sylvia. The deception unraveled quickly. Police separated Jenny from the group, and she revealed the truth about what had occurred. Officers returned to the residence and began arresting participants. Forensic examination revealed evidence carved into Sylvia's body, providing undeniable proof of prolonged, deliberate cruelty. The trial in 1966 became a media sensation. Gertrude Banishevsky, her daughter Paula, and 3 other youths faced charges. Gertrude Banishevsky was sentenced to life. Her daughter Paula was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to life. But her conviction was overturned on appeal in 1971. After a retrial in 1972, she pleaded guilty to voluntary manslaughter and was eventually released. Other participants received varying sentences, with some serving minimal time due to their ages. The courtroom testimony proved so graphic that spectators left in tears. Prosecutors presented medical evidence and testimony from Jenny Likens that painted a comprehensive picture of Sylvia's final months. Defense attorneys struggled to mount credible arguments given the overwhelming physical evidence and multiple witness accounts. Gertrude was released on parole in 1985 after serving 20 years, sparking controversy and protests. She died in 1990 under an assumed name in Iowa. The early release of someone who orchestrated such acts generated ongoing debate about justice and rehabilitation. Victims' advocates pointed to Sylvia's case when arguing for stricter parole standards. Not all disturbing cases involve extended captivity. Some occur with shocking suddenness in public spaces. James Bulger. On February 12, 1993, 2-year-old James Bulger was shopping with his mother Denise at New Strand Shopping Centre in Bootle, Merseyside. In a moment when her attention diverted, James wandered away. Security cameras captured him being led out of the shopping centre by 2 older children. The footage would become some of the most haunting images in British criminal history. What would compel children themselves to commit such an act? The 2 individuals were Robert Thompson and John Venables, both 10 years old. They had been truant from school that day and wandering through the shopping center when they encountered James. The spontaneity of the encounter raised questions about whether the subsequent events were planned or evolved opportunistically. Witnesses later reported seeing the 2 older children walking with a crying toddler through the streets of Bootle. Approximately 38 people observed them during the 2.5-mile journey, some expressing concern, but none intervening decisively. The bystander effect operated tragically, with each person perhaps assuming someone else would act or that the children were siblings. James was led to a railway embankment in Walton, where he was subjected to trauma before being left on the tracks. His body was discovered 2 days later, on February 14th, by children playing near the railway line. The location and conditions sparked an intensive police investigation. How did investigators identify the perpetrators? The security footage from the shopping center proved crucial. Police released enhanced images of the 2 older children leading James away, and the public response was immediate. Tips poured in, and within days, Thompson and Venables were identified and arrested. Both initially denied involvement before eventually confessing, though they attempted to minimize their roles and blame each other. Forensic evidence linked them definitively to the scene, including paint traces and other materials. The investigation revealed both boys came from troubled backgrounds, though this did not excuse their actions. Thompson was described as having experienced neglect and exposure to inappropriate material, while Venables showed signs of behavioral issues at school. The trial of 2 children for such a serious offense raised unprecedented legal and ethical questions. The proceedings occurred in adult court, with accommodations made for the defendants' ages, such as raising the dock so they could see. The prosecution had to prove the boys understood the difference between right and wrong, meeting the criminal responsibility threshold. Both were found guilty on November 24, 1993, and received sentences of detention at Her Majesty's pleasure, essentially indeterminate sentences. The judge recommended a minimum of 8 years, though the Home Secretary later increased this to 15 years, before the courts intervened. Thompson and Venables were released in June 2001 at age 18 with new identities and lifelong anonymity orders. The decision generated enormous controversy. James's mother, Denise Fergus, became a vocal advocate for justice system reform, questioning whether 8 years of detention adequately addressed the gravity of the offense. Venables has been returned to custody multiple times since release for various offenses, including possession of inappropriate imagery. Thompson has apparently stayed out of trouble, though his whereabouts remain protected by court order. The divergent paths of the two perpetrators fuel ongoing debates about rehabilitation potential. In late 2023 and early 2024, John Venables was once again denied parole after the board ruled he still poses a significant risk to the public. As of early 2026, he remains in an undisclosed high-security prison under a lifelong anonymity order. From England to Hong Kong, where a debt dispute would spiral into unthinkable horror. Fan Man Yi. In May 1999, a 13-year-old girl walked into a police station in Hong Kong with a disturbing story. She had witnessed a woman being held captive and harmed at an apartment in Tsim Sha Tsui. The girl reported being haunted by nightmares of the victim's ghost, demanding justice. Police initially dismissed her claims as fantasy, but she persisted with specific details. What investigators eventually uncovered would become known internationally as the Hello Kitty murder. Why did it take a child's nightmares to expose the truth? Fan Man Yi, 23 years old, worked as a hostess and struggled with substance dependencies. In early 1999, she encountered a man who operated on the margins of Hong Kong's criminal underworld. Their interaction involved a financial dispute that would prove fatal. The perpetrators included Chan Man Lok, 34, described as the ringleader, Leong Xing Cho, 27, and Leong Wai Lun, 21. The 13-year-old witness was girlfriend to one of the men and forced to participate in caring for Fan during her captivity. The girl's presence and eventual testimony would prove crucial to the investigation. Fan was held at a Granville Road apartment for approximately 1 month, beginning in March 1999. The stated reason involved an alleged debt of 4,000 Hong Kong dollars, though the severity of response far exceeded any rational collection effort. Evidence suggested substance-related paranoia may have escalated the situation beyond the initial conflict. Throughout March 1999, Fan endured various forms of harm, including being suspended from a metal frame, exposure to extreme temperatures, burns, and forced consumption of waste. The confined space of the apartment meant the young witness observed most of these acts, traumatizing her profoundly. Why she didn't flee or seek help earlier involves complex questions of fear, coercion, and limited options available to someone so young. Fan died approximately on April 15, 1999. The perpetrator's response demonstrated a calculated attempt to conceal the crime. They dismembered her body, boiled the parts to remove flesh, and stuffed the skull into a large Hello Kitty mermaid doll that had been in the apartment. The grotesque method of disposal gave the case its infamous nickname. The young witness continued living in proximity to the perpetrators for weeks, knowing what had occurred and where Fan's remains were hidden. Her nightmares intensified, and she interpreted them through a cultural lens of spirits seeking recognition. When she finally approached police in May, her story seemed implausible until investigators verified details she provided. Police executed a search warrant on the Granville Road apartment and discovered the Hello Kitty doll containing Fan's skull. Forensic examination confirmed the identity through dental records. The recovery of remains led to arrests of all 3 men, who initially denied involvement before evidence overwhelmed their claims. The trial proceedings captured international attention due to the bizarre disposal method and the extended nature of Fan's captivity. The prosecution sought conviction on capital charges, but the court ultimately found the defendants guilty of manslaughter rather than the more serious charge. The reasoning involved difficulty establishing the precise cause and timing of Phan's demise given the state of remains. While all three initially received life sentences, Leung Xing-cho's sentence was reduced to 18 years on appeal in 2004, and he was released in 2014. The ringleader, Chan Man-lok, remains incarcerated as of 2026, having had his parole applications consistently rejected. Hong Kong's life sentence typically allows parole consideration after approximately 15 to 20 years. The young witness, though, traumatized, was not charged due to her age and coerced participation. She received counseling and protection services. Authorities worked to help her reintegrate into society while processing the trauma of what she had witnessed. If you've made it this far and enjoy deep dives into the most shocking criminal cases, hit that subscribe button and don't forget to press the bell icon. Some cases remain unsolved for decades, while others shock with their immediacy and brutality. Sade Robinson. In April 2024, Milwaukee resident Sade Robinson, 19 years old, connected through a dating app with Maxwell Anderson for what she believed would be a dinner date. The college student had her whole life ahead of her, studying criminal justice at Milwaukee Area Technical College. She had no way of knowing that accepting this date would lead to one of Milwaukee's most disturbing cases in recent memory. What happened on that April evening? On April 1st, 2024, Sade met Anderson for their planned date. Surveillance footage from various locations would later trace their movements throughout the evening. They visited restaurants and other establishments in the Milwaukee area. To outside observers, nothing appeared unusual about the couple's interactions. Sade remained in contact with friends during the early part of the evening, sending messages that suggested she felt comfortable. The last confirmed sighting of Sade alive occurred late that evening. After that point, her communications ceased entirely. Her family grew concerned when she failed to return home and didn't respond to messages, behavior entirely out of character for someone who maintained close family ties. They reported her missing the following day, initiating a search that would soon take a dark turn. On April 2nd, human remains began washing up along the Lake Michigan shoreline. A severed leg was discovered first, still wearing clothing that would help with identification. Over subsequent days, additional remains surfaced at various points along the beach. The scattered nature of the discoveries suggested the body had been dismembered and disposed of in the lake, with currents carrying parts to different locations. How did investigators connect these remains to Sade and identify a suspect? Forensic examination confirmed the remains belonged to Sade Robinson through various identification methods. Detectives immediately began investigating her last known activities. The dating app connection led them to Maxwell Anderson, who became a person of interest. Surveillance footage placed Anderson's vehicle in areas near where remains were discovered, providing crucial evidence of his movements after the date. Investigators obtained search warrants for Anderson's residence and vehicle. Forensic teams discovered blood evidence and other materials linking him to Sade's demise. The evidence suggested the acts occurred at or near Anderson's residence before he transported and disposed of the remains. Tools and cleaning supplies found during searches indicated attempts to eliminate evidence. DNA analysis confirmed the blood belonged to Sade, establishing a definitive connection. Cell phone records placed both Sade and Anderson at specific locations throughout the evening, corroborating surveillance footage. The digital trail proved instrumental in reconstructing the timeline and demonstrating premeditation in disposal efforts. Maxwell Anderson, 33 years old, was arrested and charged in connection with Sade's case. As the investigation progressed, prosecutors built a case using the combination of surveillance footage, forensic evidence, and digital communications. Investigations post-arrest revealed that Anderson had a history of erratic behavior and prior legal issues involving domestic disturbances. which led many to question the safety vetting processes of dating platforms. The trial proceedings moved through the Wisconsin court system. Anderson faced multiple charges related to Sadie's demise and the subsequent disposal of remains. Prosecutors presented evidence documenting the timeline from the date through discovery of remains. The forensic testimony proved particularly crucial in establishing what had occurred and Anderson's role. What motivated Anderson to commit such acts remained unclear throughout the investigation and trial. No obvious dispute or conflict emerged from their brief interaction. The randomness of Sadie becoming his victim made the case even more disturbing for her family and community. She had simply accepted what appeared to be a normal date with someone who seemed legitimate on a dating platform. Following a high-profile trial, Maxwell Anderson was convicted in May 2025 and formally sentenced in June 2025 to life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus additional time for the mutilation of a corpse. The judge's remarks emphasized the calculated nature of the disposal efforts and the grief inflicted on Sadie's family. The relatively quick resolution from crime to conviction reflected the strength of evidence investigators gathered. Sadie's mother became an advocate for safety awareness around dating apps and meeting people online. She emphasized that her daughter had taken reasonable precautions but still fell victim to someone who concealed dangerous intent. The Milwaukee community mourned Sadie's loss, with vigils held at locations significant to her life. Friends described her as ambitious, caring, and full of potential that would never be realized. The college held memorial services honoring her memory. While Sadie's case unfolded rapidly in the modern era, an earlier tragedy in England would reveal how prolonged cruelty can occur in plain sight. Suzanne Capper. In December 1992, a severely injured young woman stumbled onto a roadway in Greater Manchester, England, managing to flag down a passing vehicle. The driver who stopped was confronted with a horrifying sight. Suzanne Capper, 16 years old, had burns covering 75 to 80% of her body. She had been set on fire and left to perish. Remarkably, she remained conscious and had been able to communicate. What had brought her to this desperate state? Born in 1976, Suzanne grew up in Moston, Manchester, in difficult circumstances. Her family situation proved unstable, and she often stayed with various acquaintances rather than maintaining a permanent home. This transient lifestyle would ultimately place her in proximity to people who meant her harm. She knew Jean Powell, a woman who lived on Langworthy Road in Moston, and spent time at Powell's residence. In December 1992, Suzanne became the target of sustained cruelty by multiple individuals at Powell's home. The group included Jean Powell, 26, Glyn Powell, 29, Bernadette McNeely, 24, and several others, including younger participants. What began with verbal taunts escalated over approximately 1 week into various forms of physical harm. Why did this group target Suzanne specifically? Investigations later suggested petty grievances and jealousies motivated the initial antagonism. Suzanne had been friendly with Jean Powell's ex-husband, creating tension. Additionally, claims circulated that Suzanne had been involved in minor thefts from the household, though these allegations were never substantiated. The supposed provocations bore no relationship to the severity of response they triggered. The group confined Suzanne within the residence, subjecting her to escalating cruelty, including burns, beatings, and having a tooth extracted. They played music loudly and repeatedly, specifically recordings that they associated with tormenting her. Multiple individuals participated in various acts, with group dynamics creating a situation where each person's individual responsibility became diffused across participants. On December 14, 1992, the group transported Suzanne to a wooded area near Stockport. They doused her with petrol and ignited it, leaving her to perish. The perpetrators believed she would die quickly and the remote location would delay discovery. However, Suzanne demonstrated remarkable survival instinct and determination. Despite her catastrophic injuries, Suzanne managed to extinguish the flames and make her way to the roadway where she was discovered. The Good Samaritan who stopped immediately called emergency services. Paramedics rushed her to hospital, where medical staff confronted injuries of almost incomprehensible severity. The burns had penetrated deep into tissue, and infection risks were enormous. During her time in hospital, Suzanne remained conscious long enough to provide crucial information to police. She identified her attackers by name, ensuring investigators knew exactly who to pursue. This dying declaration would prove instrumental in securing convictions. Medical staff did everything possible to treat her injuries, but the damage proved too extensive. Suzanne Capper died on December 18, 1992, 4 days after the attack. Her final act had been ensuring justice by naming those responsible. Police immediately moved to arrest the individuals she had identified. Raids on the Langworthy Road residence and associated locations led to quick apprehension of all involved parties. Forensic examination of Powell's home revealed evidence corroborating Suzanne's account. Blood traces, burn marks, and other physical evidence documented what had occurred. Neighbors reported having heard sounds from the residence, but not realizing the severity of what was happening. The failure of anyone to investigate or report concerning signs became a point of community reflection. Investigators documented the residence methodically, photographing rooms where various acts had taken place. The physical evidence confirmed that the group had used pliers to remove her teeth while playing the theme song from the horror film Child's Play, with the character Chucky being used by the perpetrators as a persona to taunt and terrify her. Music equipment used during her captivity was seized as evidence. The accumulation of physical proof left no doubt about the sustained nature of her ordeal, or the participation of multiple individuals. The trial proceedings in 1993 drew intense media coverage. Jean Powell, Glyn Powell, and Bernadette McNeely all received life sentences. Additional participants received varying terms based on their ages and levels of involvement. Judge Francis Potts remarked on the appalling nature of the acts, noting the prolonged and deliberate cruelty involved. While some were released, Bernadette McNeely and Jean Powell served over 20 years before being paroled. However, McNeely's release in particular remains a subject of intense controversy in the British press. From England to Indiana, where another young person would fall victim to a group attack. Shanda Sharer. In January 1992, 12-year-old Shanda Sharer attended a sleepover at a friend's house in Jeffersonville, Indiana. She was a typical middle school student, navigating friendships and school activities. That night would be her last. 4 teenage girls arrived at the home claiming they were taking Shanda to meet someone. What followed would become one of Indiana's most notorious cases involving youth offenders. The 4 individuals were Melinda Lovelace, 16, Lori Tackett, 17, Hope Rippey, 15, and Tony Lawrence, 15. Melinda harbored intense jealousy related to romantic relationships and believed Shanda had interfered. This adolescent romantic drama would escalate into unthinkable acts. The girls drove Shanda to a remote location where they subjected her to prolonged harm over several hours. The sequence of events demonstrated escalating cruelty, with each participant playing different roles. Some actively participated, while others watched or drove the vehicle between locations. The group dynamics created a situation where individual moral boundaries collapsed under peer influence and fear of opposing the ringleaders. How could teenagers perpetrate such acts against a peer? Eventually, the group transported Shanda to a rural area and set her on fire while she was still alive. Forensic examination later confirmed she remained conscious during the burning, making her final moments almost incomprehensibly horrific. The perpetrators left the scene believing they had eliminated evidence of their actions. Shanda's remains were discovered on January 11, 1992, by a hunter in a field near Madison, Indiana. The condition of the body immediately indicated this was no accident. Police launched an intensive investigation, focusing on anyone who might have had contact with Shanda before her disappearance. Her family provided information about her recent activities and social connections. The investigation moved quickly due to the age of those involved and their limited ability to conceal their actions. Within days, the 4 girls were identified and arrested. During questioning, they confessed to their roles, though each attempted to minimize personal responsibility and blame others. The confessions provided investigators with a detailed timeline of events from abduction through disposal. Background investigations revealed troubling histories for several perpetrators. Melinda Loveless had experienced trauma in her home environment. Lori Tackett also came from a troubled background, with exposure to inappropriate influences. However, these circumstances did not excuse their choices or diminish Shanda's suffering. Psychological evaluations conducted during trial proceedings revealed various issues, but all were deemed competent to understand their actions and face consequences. The trial proceedings required addressing whether teenagers should be tried as adults for such serious offenses. All 4 received significant sentences. Melinda Loveless, 60 years, Lori Tackett, 60 years, Hope Rippey, 50 years, and Tony Lawrence, 20 years. The variation reflected different levels of participation and cooperation with investigators. All 4 have since been released after serving substantial portions of their sentences. Melinda Loveless was released in 2019, Lori Tackett in 2018, and the others earlier. The releases generated mixed reactions from the community and Shanda's family. The case influenced juvenile justice policy discussions, particularly regarding how courts handle group crimes where peer pressure plays a role. Shanda's memory lives on through her family's advocacy work. Not all disturbing cases involve premeditation. Some stem from untreated mental illness manifesting in sudden, shocking acts. Tim McLean. On July 30th, 2008, Tim McLean, 22 years old, boarded a Greyhound bus in Edmonton, Alberta, heading to Winnipeg to visit family. The young carnival worker had been traveling for work and looked forward to time with loved ones. He settled into his seat for the long overnight journey, unaware another passenger would soon change everything. What happened on that bus would shock Canada and raise fundamental questions about mental health and public safety. Also aboard was Vince Lee, a 40-year-old man who had immigrated from China years earlier. Lee suffered from schizophrenia, but had not been receiving consistent treatment. On this particular night, his untreated mental illness manifested in delusional thinking that would have catastrophic consequences. Lee believed he was receiving commands from a higher power, delusions that drove his subsequent actions. As the bus traveled along the Trans-Canada Highway near Portage-la Prairie, Manitoba, Lee suddenly attacked Tim McLean without warning or provocation. The assault occurred around 8 in the evening, while most passengers were dozing or occupied with their own activities. Lee used a large knife to inflict fatal injuries, continuing the attack even after Tim was clearly deceased. Passengers and the driver reacted with understandable panic. The bus driver managed to stop the vehicle and evacuate all other passengers safely. They fled to the roadway, many using cell phones to call emergency services. The bus sat on the highway with Lee still inside, visible through windows as he continued his disturbed actions. Evidence later revealed Lee had engaged in additional disturbing acts, including partial consumption of remains. Royal Canadian Mounted Police arrived at the scene and established a perimeter around the bus. A standoff developed as officers worked to communicate with Lee and assess the situation. Lee showed no recognition of having done anything wrong. consistent with someone experiencing a complete psychotic break from reality. His responses to officers made clear he believed he was following important instructions, not committing a crime. After several hours, Lee attempted to escape through a bus window, but was apprehended by waiting officers. His arrest occurred without further incident. Police secured the scene and began the difficult process of documenting what had occurred. The remote highway location meant coordinating response from multiple jurisdictions and managing traumatized witnesses. The investigation quickly established Lee's identity and began examining his background. Born in 1968 in China, Lee had come to Canada seeking better opportunities. He worked various jobs and seemed to be building a life. However, mental health issues that began manifesting in his 20s had worsened over time. He had stopped taking prescribed medications, allowing his schizophrenia to progress untreated. Medical records showed Lee had been diagnosed years earlier but had difficulty maintaining consistent care. Employment instability and social isolation had contributed to treatment gaps. Family members in China reported noticing concerning behavioral changes during infrequent communications. The investigation revealed a pattern of missed opportunities for intervention that might have prevented the tragedy. The legal proceedings centered on Lee's mental state rather than guilt for the physical acts. Psychiatric evaluations confirmed he had been experiencing severe psychotic delusions during the attack. Multiple experts agreed Lee genuinely believed he was following divine instructions to prevent a greater harm. He showed no understanding that Tim McLean was an innocent person deserving protection. In March 2009, Lee was found not criminally responsible due to mental disorder. This verdict meant he would be held in a secure psychiatric facility rather than prison. The decision generated significant controversy. Tim's family understandably struggled with the concept that their son's life had been taken, but no one would be punished in the traditional criminal justice sense. Lee, who later changed his name to Will Baker, received intensive psychiatric treatment in secure facilities. His medication was carefully managed and monitored. Over years, he demonstrated stability and remorse for what had occurred during his psychotic episode. In 2012, he expressed apology to Tim's family, saying, "I am sorry for killing your son," though acknowledging no words could undo the harm. In February 2017, after review boards determined he no longer posed a danger, Baker was granted an absolute discharge. He was released without conditions, though he voluntarily continued treatment. The discharge sparked renewed controversy, with many questioning whether someone who had committed such acts should ever be fully freed. Tim McLean's family maintained that while they understood the mental health aspects, they lived daily with their loss. His mother, Carol Dedeli, became an advocate for victims' rights and mental health system reforms. From a bus in Canada to the dark underbelly of Adelaide, Australia, where coordinated predators operated for years. Richard Kelvin. In June 1983, 15-year-old Richard Kelvin disappeared while walking home from a movie theater in Adelaide, South Australia. His vanishing would eventually be connected to a series of cases known as the family murders, named for speculation about an organized group of perpetrators. Richard's body was discovered weeks later, bearing evidence of prolonged captivity and harm. The investigation would span decades and challenge Adelaide's self-image as a safe, quiet city. Who were these predators operating in plain sight? Richard Kelvin, son of prominent Adelaide television news presenter Rob Kelvin, was targeted on June 5, 1983. He had attended a movie at the Regal Theatre in Kensington and was walking the short distance home when he was abducted. The location was a residential area where such disappearances seemed unthinkable. His family reported him missing immediately when he failed to arrive home. Richard's remains were discovered on July 24, 1983, in the Adelaide Hills. Forensic examination revealed he had been held captive for approximately 5 weeks before his demise. Evidence included marks consistent with restraints and exposure to various substances. The positioning of the body suggested deliberate placement rather than concealment, almost taunting investigators. The investigation linked Richard's case to several similar disappearances of young men in Adelaide between 1979 and 1983. The victims shared certain characteristics, and the manner of their abductions and disposal suggested common perpetrators. Police theorized they were dealing with a network of individuals rather than a lone offender. Bevan Spencer von Einem, a 44-year-old accountant, became the primary suspect. Forensic evidence proved crucial. Fibers from von Einem's home matched those found on Richard's body, and hair samples provided additional links. Police believed von Einem was part of a larger group but struggled to develop evidence against others. Von Einem's background revealed a respectable surface hiding darker proclivities. He held professional employment and maintained social connections. Nothing in his public persona suggested the acts he allegedly committed. Investigators believed he and others in the family used their positions and resources to target vulnerable individuals. Von Einem was arrested and charged specifically with Richard Kelvin's case. The trial in 1984 focused on forensic evidence and circumstantial connections. He was convicted and received life imprisonment with a non-parole period. However, the question of other participants remained unresolved. Despite extensive investigation, police never charged additional suspects in the family murders cases. Von Einem consistently denied involvement despite the conviction, refusing to provide information about potential accomplices. In 2019, journalist Debbie Marshall conducted extensive research and interviewed associates for her work. Killing for the family, von Einem remained notoriously tight-lipped and never granted a formal tell-all interview that provided any closure regarding the other missing boys. Cold case reviews in 2008 through 2010 re-examined all evidence but failed to produce new charges. DNA technology had advanced significantly since the original investigations, yet the evidence available either didn't include biological material or failed to match anyone in databases. The suspected network appeared to have avoided leaving sufficient evidence to enable additional prosecutions. Bevan Spencer von Einem, one of Australia's most notorious prisoners, died of natural causes at Yatala Labour Prison on September 1, 2024, at the age of 78. His death brought a form of closure to Richard's family, but left open questions about the full scope of the family murders. Richard's father, Rob Kelvin, had used his media platform to advocate for justice and support other families affected by the cases. The Kelvin family's prominence meant Richard's case received sustained attention that helped drive investigative resources. Adelaide's sense of safety was fundamentally altered by the family murders cases. The revelation that a network of predators had operated for years challenged assumptions about community security. Stephanie Isaacson. On June 1, 1989, a young girl was walking to El Dorado High School in Las Vegas, Nevada, when she was abducted from the route she regularly took to school. Stephanie Isaacson never arrived at school that morning, triggering immediate concern from her family and teachers, who knew her to be reliable and responsible. Her backpack and belongings were found scattered in a desert area near her route, leading searchers to discover her body. She had been harmed in a brutal encounter that shocked the Las Vegas community and launched an investigation that would span more than 3 decades before reaching resolution. The crime scene evidence was collected using the forensic methods available in the late 1980s, though DNA technology was still in its early stages of development and not yet widely applied to criminal investigations. Biological evidence was preserved from the scene, though the sample was extremely small, measuring just 0.12 nanograms, approximately 15 cells worth of genetic material. This microscopic amount would prove both challenging and ultimately crucial to solving the case decades later, representing one of the smallest DNA samples ever successfully analyzed. Investigators interviewed numerous individuals in the weeks and months following Stephanie's death, including students from her school, neighbors from her area, and anyone who might have been in the vicinity that morning. They followed various leads and explored connections to other cases in the Las Vegas area, including another tragic incident from 1986 involving a victim named Nanette Vanderberg. Despite extensive efforts and dedication from detectives, no suspect could be definitively identified using the investigative tools and forensic capabilities available at that time. The case gradually went cold as leads were exhausted and new information stopped coming in, though it was never officially closed or forgotten by the detectives who had worked it. For 32 years, the minimal evidence remained in carefully controlled storage, while DNA technology advanced dramatically around it. Detectives periodically reviewed the case file, hoping that new techniques might provide the breakthrough they needed. The breakthrough finally came in 2021, when a local resident named Justin Wu, moved by Stephanie's story, donated $5,000 to fund advanced DNA testing through Othram Labs, a company specializing in extracting genetic information from extremely degraded or minimal samples that other laboratories might deem impossible to analyze. The laboratory successfully sequenced the tiny DNA sample using cutting-edge technology that had not existed when Stephanie died. They created a genetic profile that could be analyzed and compared against databases and genealogical records. Using forensic genetic genealogy techniques, investigators uploaded the DNA profile to public databases where it was compared against millions of genetic profiles submitted by people innocently researching their ancestry and family histories. The analysis identified a match to relatives of Darren Roy Marchand, a Las Vegas resident who had been investigated in connection with the 1986 Vanderberg case, but never charged due to insufficient evidence at that time. Additional DNA samples that had been preserved from the earlier investigation were retrieved and tested, confirming Marchand as Stephanie's killer with scientific certainty. The genetic evidence linked him definitively to both cases, revealing a pattern that investigators had suspected but been unable to prove decades earlier. However, justice in the traditional sense proved impossible to achieve. Marchand had died by his own hand in 1995, just 6 years after Stephanie's death and 26 years before being identified as her killer through genetic genealogy. The resolution brought complex and painful emotions for Stephanie's family, who had waited over 3 decades for answers. Her mother expressed relief at finally knowing who was responsible, stating in an interview that she was glad they found who had harmed her daughter. However, she also acknowledged the bitter reality that there was no justice for Stephanie in the traditional sense, as Marchand would never face trial or be held publicly accountable for what he had done. Retired Deputy Chief Mike Hawkins, who had worked the case for years, reflected on the frustration of the outcome, acknowledging that someone had gotten away with taking a life simply by dying before being identified. The case marked a significant milestone in forensic science, demonstrating that even the tiniest DNA samples, once thought too small to be useful, could be analyzed to identify perpetrators using modern technology. It also highlighted the bitter reality that some killers escape earthly accountability by dying before advanced science catches up to them. The next case would involve a school setting and a perpetrator with a documented history: Sarah Yarborough. On December 14, 1991, 16-year-old Sarah Yarborough arrived at Federal Way High School near Seattle, Washington, for drill team practice. Sarah was an honors student and dedicated member of the drill team, arriving early that morning to prepare for practice. She parked her car and began walking toward the building when someone approached her. She never made it inside. Sarah's body was discovered in bushes on the school property. Her drill team uniform had been partially removed, and biological evidence was found on her clothing. The scene suggested she had fought against her attacker, with items scattered across the area indicating a struggle. Investigators determined the attack was predatory in nature, with the perpetrator apparently waiting for an opportunistic victim. The investigation involved extensive interviews with students, staff, and anyone who had been on or near school property that morning. Physical evidence was collected and preserved, including biological material that yielded a DNA profile. Despite following numerous leads and investigating various individuals, detectives were unable to identify a suspect. The case remained unsolved for nearly 3 decades, haunting the Federal Way community and Sarah's family. The breakthrough came in 2019 when forensic genetic genealogy was applied to the case. Identifinders International, a company specializing in this technique, uploaded the perpetrator's DNA profile to GEDmatch and other genealogy databases. The analysis identified potential relatives and allowed genealogists to build detailed family trees going back multiple generations. This process led investigators to Patrick Leon Nicholas, who had been 27 at the time of Sarah's death. Nicholas had a documented criminal history that should have raised red flags. He had been convicted of attempted harm against a woman in 1983 and later faced charges related to inappropriate contact with a minor in 1993. His pattern involved approaching women near vehicles and using intimidation. Despite these convictions, he had been released and was living freely when Sarah was killed. To confirm the genetic genealogy findings, investigators conducted surveillance and collected items Nicholas had discarded. DNA from a napkin and cigarette butt matched the crime scene evidence with odds of 1 in 120 quadrillion, providing definitive scientific proof of his involvement. When investigators interviewed Nicholas after his arrest, he asked questions that investigators found revealing about his awareness of the case. Nicholas was prosecuted and in 2023 received a sentence of 45 years in prison. The conviction brought relief to Sarah's family after 28 years of waiting. However, the case also raised troubling questions about how Nicholas had been able to harm Sarah despite his prior convictions. The disturbing element was that the system had released him after his 1983 conviction, giving him the opportunity to take Sarah's life 8 years later. While that case ended with conviction, the next would involve evidence from an unlikely source: Crystal Beslanovich. On December 19, 1995, 17-year-old Crystal Beslanovich was found deceased on the frozen shore of the Provo River in Utah. Crystal had been spending time with friends earlier that evening before the encounter that ended her life. The scene was discovered by people in the area, and investigators responded to find evidence suggesting a violent confrontation had occurred. The location presented unique challenges for evidence collection. The area was rocky and partially frozen, making the documentation and preservation of potential evidence difficult. However, investigators carefully processed the scene, collecting items including rocks and other materials that might bear biological evidence. Traditional DNA testing methods available in the mid-1990s yielded limited results from the samples collected. The investigation involved interviewing Crystal's friends and acquaintances to establish a timeline of her final hours. Detectives explored various theories and followed leads, but no clear suspect emerged from the initial investigation. The case went cold, though the evidence was carefully maintained in storage, with the hope that advancing technology might someday provide new investigative opportunities. For 18 years, the case remained unsolved. In 2013, investigators decided to re-examine the physical evidence using a relatively new technique called MVAC technology. This method uses a specialized vacuum to extract DNA from porous surfaces, like rocks and wood, that traditional swabbing might miss. The MVAC was applied to rocks collected from the scene, successfully recovering DNA that had not been detected by earlier testing methods. The DNA profile was compared against databases and yielded a match to Joseph Michael Simpson, a man who had been convicted of another serious offense in 1987. The database hit provided investigators with probable cause to obtain additional samples from Simpson, which confirmed the match. Further investigation revealed that Simpson had been in the Provo area at the time of Crystal's death, placing him at the scene. Simpson was arrested and charged with Crystal's case. During the legal proceedings, forensic experts testified about the MVAC technology and how it had recovered DNA that earlier methods had failed to detect. The scientific evidence was compelling, demonstrating how the perpetrator's genetic material had been transferred to the rocks during the encounter with Crystal. Additional DNA was also found under Crystal's fingernails, suggesting she had fought against her attacker. In 2016, Simpson was convicted and received a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. The conviction brought closure to Crystal's family after 2 decades of waiting for answers. The case became significant in forensic science circles for demonstrating the effectiveness of MVAC technology in recovering DNA from difficult surfaces. It also revealed the disturbing pattern of Simpson's escalating behavior, with Crystal's case connected to an earlier offense from 1987. The next investigation would take even longer to solve and end in a shocking manner. Arliss Perry. On October 12, 1974, 19-year-old Arliss Perry was found deceased inside Stanford Memorial Church on the Stanford University campus in Palo Alto, California. Arliss was a newlywed who had recently moved to California with her husband while he attended Stanford. She had gone to the church alone around 11:30 that evening, intending to pray. When she did not return home, her husband went looking for her and alerted campus security. The discovery was made by a security guard who found the church's doors locked from the inside. Upon entering, he discovered Arliss in a disturbing scene that suggested ritualistic elements. She had been positioned in a specific manner, and various items from the church had been placed around her body. The nature of the scene led investigators to consider various theories about the perpetrator's motivations and whether this might be connected to other cases. The investigation was extensive, involving interviews with hundreds of individuals connected to Stanford and the surrounding community. Detectives explored possible connections to other incidents and investigated whether the crime had occult or ritualistic significance. Despite collecting physical evidence, including clothing and biological material, investigators were unable to identify a suspect using the forensic methods available in the mid-1970s. The case became one of Stanford's most infamous unsolved mysteries, haunting the university community for decades. Arliss's family endured 44 years without answers, never knowing who had taken her life or why she had been targeted. Various theories circulated over the years, but none led to a definitive identification of the perpetrator. The breakthrough came in 2018 when DNA evidence from clothing found at the scene was analyzed using modern techniques and compared against genetic databases. The analysis identified a match to Stephen Blake Crawford, a man who had worked as a security guard at Stanford at the time of Arliss's death. This revelation was shocking because Crawford had been in a position of trust on campus and would have had access to buildings, including the church. Investigators began preparing to arrest Crawford and question him about the case. However, when officers approached his residence to execute the arrest warrant, events took an unexpected turn. Crawford took his own life as police closed in, preventing any interrogation or trial. The suicide meant that many questions about his motivations and whether he was connected to other cases would never be answered. The resolution brought complicated emotions for Arliss's family. While they finally knew who had killed her, Crawford's death denied them the opportunity to hear him explain his actions or to see him face justice in a courtroom. The case was exceptionally cleared due to the death of the suspect, providing answers after 44 years, but leaving some questions forever unanswered. The disturbing element was that someone entrusted with campus security had been responsible for one of Stanford's most notorious crimes. Another case would involve a university setting with its own shocking resolution. Sophie Sergey. On April 26, 1993, 20-year-old Sophie Sergey was found deceased in a bathtub at a dormitory on the University of Alaska Fairbanks campus. Sophie was not a student at the university, but had been visiting friends who lived in the dormitory. She had gone to use the bathroom facilities and never returned. Her body was discovered by a dormitory resident, and the scene showed evidence of a violent encounter. The investigation revealed that Sophie had been harmed in multiple ways, including being shot. The violence appeared sudden and unprovoked, suggesting the perpetrator may have encountered her opportunistically in the bathroom facility. Investigators collected biological evidence from the scene and began interviewing dormitory residents and anyone who had been on campus that evening. Despite these extensive efforts, no suspect was identified in the initial investigation. The case went cold for 26 years, becoming one of Alaska's most frustrating unsolved cases. Sophie's family, who were from a small Alaskan community, endured decades without knowing who had killed her or why. The randomness of the attack made it particularly difficult for them to process, as Sophie had simply been visiting friends and using a bathroom facility when she was targeted. The breakthrough came in 2019, when investigators applied genetic genealogy to DNA evidence from the scene. The DNA profile was uploaded to public genealogy databases, and specialists began building family trees to identify potential matches. The analysis led to relatives of Stephen H. Downs, a nurse living in Maine who had been a student at the University of Alaska Fairbanks at the time of Sophie's death. Further investigation revealed that Downs had been living in the same dormitory where Sophie was found. He had been a fellow student who would have had regular access to the building and its facilities. Investigators traveled to Maine to interview Downs and collect a DNA sample for comparison. The sample confirmed what genetic genealogy had suggested, providing definitive proof of his involvement in Sophie's death. Downs was extradited to Alaska to face charges. During the legal proceedings, he maintained his innocence despite the overwhelming DNA evidence. The prosecution presented testimony about the genetic genealogy process and how it had identified Downs, as well as traditional forensic evidence connecting him to the scene. The defense attempted to challenge the use of genealogy databases, raising privacy concerns about the practice. In 2022, Downs was convicted and received a sentence of 75 years in prison. He has filed appeals challenging various aspects of his conviction, including the use of genetic genealogy and the handling of DNA evidence. As of 2025, these appeals were still being considered by courts. For Sophie's family, the conviction provided answers and justice after 26 years, though the randomness of the attack and Downs' lack of remorse made the resolution bittersweet. The next case would involve a perpetrator hiding behind a position of trust. Linda Slayton. On September 13, 1981, 31-year-old Linda Slayton was found deceased in her Lakeland, Florida, home where she lived with her family. Linda was a mother who had been going about her normal routine when she was attacked in her own residence. Her young son was present in the home, but was unharmed during the incident, though the trauma of that day would affect him for the rest of his life. The discovery was made by family members who arrived at the home, and the scene showed evidence of a violent encounter that had occurred inside what should have been a safe space. Investigators from the Lakeland Police Department collected physical evidence from the home, including biological material that yielded a DNA profile using the forensic methods available in the early 1980s. They interviewed neighbors who might have seen someone approaching or leaving the property, family members who knew Linda's daily routines and relationships, and anyone else who might have information about her activities. or who might have been in the area that day. Despite extensive investigation involving hundreds of hours of detective work, no suspect was identified using the forensic tools and databases available in the early 1980s. The case eventually went cold, leaving Linda's family without answers for nearly 4 decades. For Linda's son, growing up without knowing who had killed his mother was particularly difficult and shaped his entire childhood. He lived with the mystery throughout his formative years and into adulthood, wondering if he would ever learn the truth about what had happened that September day. The community remained supportive of the family over the decades. But as years passed with no progress, hope for resolution gradually faded, even as the pain of loss remained constant. The breakthrough finally came in 2019 when genetic genealogy was applied to Linda's case. The DNA profile from the scene was uploaded to public genealogy databases, and specialists began the painstaking process of building detailed family trees to identify the perpetrator. The analysis led investigators to Joseph Clinton Mills, a name that would prove particularly shocking and painful to Linda's family when they learned his identity and his connection to their lives. Mills had been a youth football coach in the Lakeland area during the years following Linda's death. Most disturbingly, he had coached Linda's son during the boy's childhood, serving as a mentor figure and trusted adult in the child's life during the very years when he was trying to process his mother's loss. He had been present at games and practices, interacting with the family and community, all while keeping the secret of what he had done to Linda. The revelation that Mills had been responsible for Linda's death while simultaneously coaching her son was deeply disturbing and represented a profound betrayal of trust that extended beyond the original crime. Investigators conducted careful surveillance of Mills and collected items he had discarded to confirm the genetic genealogy findings without alerting him to the investigation. The DNA comparison provided definitive scientific proof of his involvement, and additional evidence, including a palm print recovered from the crime scene, connected him physically to Linda's home on the day of her death. When confronted with the overwhelming evidence, Mills was arrested and charged with Linda's case 38 years after the fact. During the legal proceedings in 2022, prosecutors presented the DNA evidence along with detailed testimony about how Mills had inserted himself into the family's life after killing Linda. The calculated nature of the betrayal was emphasized as an aggravating factor that demonstrated Mills's character and lack of remorse. The prosecution argued that Mills had deliberately positioned himself to monitor the investigation and the family's response to Linda's death. Mills was convicted after a trial where the jury heard about both the scientific evidence and the disturbing pattern of his behavior after the crime. He received a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole, ensuring he would never be released. For Linda's son, now an adult with his own family, the resolution brought answers he had sought his entire life, but also forced him to confront the painful reality that someone he had trusted and looked up to as a youth had been his mother's killer all along. The disturbing ending lay in Mills's calculated decision to coach the son of the woman he had killed, a level of deception and manipulation that shocked even experienced investigators who had seen many cases over their careers. If you've made it this far and enjoyed deep dives into the most shocking criminal cases, hit that subscribe button and don't forget to press the bell icon. The next case would connect to one of the most infamous criminals in American history, Janelle Cruz. On May 4, 1986, 18-year-old Janelle Cruz was found deceased in her Irvine, California, home where she had been house-sitting for her family while they were away on vacation. Janelle was a responsible and dependable young woman who had been trusted to watch over the residents during her family's absence, a task she had performed before without any problems. When family members returned from their trip and discovered what had happened in their home, they were devastated to learn that their residence had become the site of such a terrible crime against someone they loved. The scene showed evidence of a violent encounter, and investigators from the Orange County Sheriff's Department responded immediately to process the evidence and begin their investigation into what had happened. Biological evidence was collected from the scene using the forensic methods available in the mid-1980s, including samples that would later prove crucial to solving the case. Investigators canvassed the neighborhood extensively, interviewed neighbors who might have seen suspicious activity or unfamiliar vehicles in the area, and explored various leads that emerged during the investigation. However, despite extensive efforts and hundreds of hours of detective work, no suspect was identified at that time using the investigative tools and databases available. What investigators did not know in 1986 was that Janelle's case was connected to a much larger and more terrifying pattern of crimes that had terrorized California communities throughout the 1970s and 80s. The perpetrator responsible for Janelle's death had committed numerous offenses across multiple counties in the state, though authorities investigating in different jurisdictions had not yet connected all the cases to a single individual. The various police departments and sheriff's offices working different incidents had not realized they were all hunting the same person, who had been operating across Northern and Southern California for over a decade. For 32 years, Janelle's case remained officially unsolved, though investigators periodically reviewed the evidence, hoping for a breakthrough. The DNA profile from the scene was compared against databases, but no matches were found. The case seemed destined to remain cold indefinitely, as the perpetrator had apparently stopped committing crimes and vanished without a trace. The breakthrough came in 2018 when genetic genealogy was applied to the DNA evidence in a groundbreaking investigation that would change criminal justice forever. Investigators uploaded the perpetrator's genetic profile to GEDmatch, a public genealogy database, and began building extensive family trees going back multiple generations. This painstaking work led to Joseph James DeAngelo, a former police officer living in suburban Sacramento. DeAngelo had been born in 1945 and had served in the military before becoming a police officer. He had worked in law enforcement during some of the years when he was actively committing crimes, using his knowledge of police procedures to avoid detection. After being fired from a police department in 1979, he had continued his pattern before apparently stopping in the late 1980s. He then lived quietly for 3 decades, raising a family and working in various jobs while keeping his past hidden. When investigators conducted surveillance and collected DNA from items DeAngelo discarded, the comparison confirmed what genetic genealogy had suggested. He was arrested in April 2018 and charged not only with Janelle's case, but with numerous other offenses spanning years. The arrest solved dozens of cases across California that had haunted communities for decades. DeAngelo became known as the Golden State Killer, a name that encompassed his various crime sprees. Rather than face trial, DeAngelo entered a plea agreement in 2020 to avoid the death penalty. He pleaded guilty to multiple cases and received consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. During the sentencing hearing, victims and family members from dozens of cases gave impact statements describing decades of trauma and fear. For Janelle's family, the resolution came 34 years after her death, and they learned their case was part of a much larger pattern. In 2025, a book was published providing new details about the investigation, offering insights into how DeAngelo had evaded capture for so long. The disturbing element was that a former police officer had used his training to commit crimes and avoid detection for decades, and that someone who appeared to be a normal suburban grandfather had been responsible for such extensive harm. DeAngelo's case became the most prominent example of how genetic genealogy could solve seemingly impossible cold cases. While that case involved someone with law enforcement training, the next would reveal another kind of deception. Annette Schnee. On January 6, 1982, 2 women disappeared while trying to get rides on the same evening near Breckenridge, Colorado, during harsh winter conditions. 21-year-old Annette Schnee and 29-year-old Bobby Joe Oberholzer had been in the area separately, both attempting to hitchhike or catch rides during a bitterly cold winter night when temperatures were dangerously low. Neither woman arrived at her intended destination, and both were reported missing by concerned family and friends who knew something was seriously wrong when they failed to make contact or return home. Annette's body was discovered months later in a remote wooded area after the snow had melted in the spring, while Bobby Joe's was found in a different location some distance away. Both women had been shot, and evidence suggested they had been picked up by the same person on that January night, though they had been at different locations and did not know each other. Investigators collected evidence from both scenes, including biological material and other physical evidence like shell casings, and began the difficult task of trying to identify who had encountered both women separately on the same evening. The investigation involved extensive interviews with residents of the Breckenridge area and following numerous leads over the years that followed. Detectives explored various theories about who might have been driving in the area that night, with opportunity to encounter both women at different times. And they examined records of vehicles and people who had been in the vicinity. Despite decades of work and periodic reviews of the case file, no suspect was definitively identified using traditional investigative methods and databases. The case became one of Colorado's most frustrating unsolved double homicides, haunting investigators who worked on it. The investigation took an ironic and disturbing turn when authorities uncovered records from the night of the crimes. On that same January night in 1982, a man had become stuck in a snowdrift not far from where the women had last been seen. Rescue personnel had responded and helped free the man's vehicle from the snow, sending him safely on his way. Decades later, investigators would learn the chilling truth about who that stranded motorist had been. The breakthrough came in 2021 when DNA evidence from the crime scenes was analyzed using genetic genealogy. The analysis led to Alan Lee Phillips, a miner who had been living in the Breckenridge area at the time. Further investigation revealed that Phillips was the same person who had been rescued from the snowdrift on the night of the crimes. Authorities had unknowingly helped the killer get his vehicle unstuck after he had harmed the 2 women. When confronted with the DNA evidence, Phillips was arrested and charged with both homicides. Additional evidence, including a blood match and DNA from items Phillips had discarded, confirmed his involvement. The case proceeded to trial, where prosecutors presented the genetic evidence along with circumstantial evidence, placing Phillips in the area and demonstrating his opportunity to encounter both women. Phillips was convicted and received 2 life sentences in 2022. However, the disturbing ending took another turn when Phillips died by his own hand while incarcerated in prison shortly after his conviction. The suicide meant that he would never serve out his full sentences or potentially provide information about whether there were other victims. For the families of Annette and Bobby Joe, the resolution brought answers after 40 years. But Phillips's death denied them the full justice of seeing him serve his sentences. The most chilling aspect was the irony that rescue personnel had helped him on the very night he had committed the crimes. The next case would involve another perpetrator who took his own life to avoid accountability. Danielle Houchins. On September 24, 1996, a young girl disappeared from the Huntley area of Montana, sparking an immediate search involving law enforcement and community volunteers. Danielle Houchins had been spending time in the area and was last seen before vanishing without a trace. Her disappearance triggered fears throughout the small Montana community, and search teams combed through fields and wooded areas looking for any sign of her. Her body was discovered in a field days later, ending hopes that she might still be found alive. Evidence collected from the scene included biological material that was preserved using the forensic methods available in the mid-1990s. Investigators interviewed numerous individuals in the community, explored various theories, and followed leads. But no suspect was identified despite extensive efforts. The case went cold, leaving Danielle's family without answers for nearly 3 decades. The evidence from Danielle's case remained in storage as DNA technology advanced over the following decades. Cold case investigators periodically reviewed the file, hoping that new techniques might provide the breakthrough needed to identify the perpetrator. The community never forgot Danielle, with her case remaining one of Montana's most haunting unsolved crimes from that era. The breakthrough came in 2024 when genetic genealogy was applied to hair evidence from the case. DNA was successfully extracted from the hair samples and uploaded to genealogy databases where specialists began building family trees to identify potential suspects. The analysis led investigators to Paul Hutchinson, who had been a student in the Huntley area at the time of Danielle's death. Hutchinson had been living quietly in Montana for nearly 3 decades, seemingly leading a normal life with no apparent connection to any criminal activity. When investigators identified him through genetic genealogy, they approached him for an interview to discuss the case. Hutchinson agreed to speak with investigators, and during that interview, they confronted him with the DNA evidence linking him to Danielle's case. However, before charges could be filed or the investigation could be completed, Hutchinson died by his own hand shortly after the interview with law enforcement. His suicide came as investigators were building their case and preparing to present evidence to prosecutors. The timing suggested he knew the DNA evidence was irrefutable and chose to avoid facing justice rather than be held accountable. Hutchinson's wife spoke publicly after his death, expressing shock at the allegations and describing the husband she had known for years, who bore no resemblance to someone capable of such an act. Her statements reflected the common theme in many of these cases, where family members of perpetrators struggled to reconcile the person they knew with the crimes they committed. For Danielle's family, the resolution was bittersweet. The DNA evidence had definitively identified who was responsible after 28 years. But Hutchinson's suicide meant there would never be a trial, no public accounting of what happened, and no opportunity for the family to confront him or hear him explain his actions. The case was exceptionally cleared due to the death of the suspect, providing answers but denying traditional justice. Another case would also end with a deceased suspect identified decades after the crime. Marilyn Decker. On February 18, 1987, 33-year-old Marilyn Decker was found deceased in her Davie, Florida apartment. Marilyn had been going about her normal routine when she was attacked in her own home. The discovery was made when she failed to show up for expected appointments, prompting concerned friends to check on her welfare. The scene showed evidence of a violent encounter, and investigators from the Davie Police Department responded to process the evidence. Biological evidence was collected from the scene, including hair samples that were preserved using the forensic methods available in the late 1980s. Investigators interviewed neighbors, friends, and anyone who might have information about Marilyn's activities or who might have been in the area. They explored various theories and followed leads. But despite extensive efforts, no suspect was identified using the investigative tools available at that time. The case went cold, joining thousands of other unsolved homicides from that era. For 38 years, Marilyn's case remained unsolved. Her family endured decades without knowing who had taken her life or why she had been targeted in her own home. The evidence remained carefully stored, waiting for technology to advance enough to provide new investigative opportunities. Detectives who worked cold cases periodically reviewed the file, but without a viable suspect or new leads, the case seemed destined to remain unsolved. The breakthrough came in 2025 when DNA testing was performed on the preserved hair samples using advanced techniques that had not existed when Marilyn died. The analysis successfully extracted DNA from the hair shafts and created a genetic profile that could be compared against databases. The comparison yielded a match to Donald Lawless, a man with an extensive criminal history who had been active in the Broward County area. Further investigation revealed that Lawless had died in 1995, just 8 years after Marilyn's death and 30 years before being identified as her killer. Records showed that Lawless had been involved in various criminal activities throughout his life, suggesting a pattern of behavior that had escalated to the most serious level with Marilyn's case. His death from natural causes meant he had never been held accountable for what he had done to Marilyn. The identification of Lawless brought closure to Marilyn's family after 38 years of waiting. They finally knew who was responsible and could process their loss with that knowledge. However, Lawless's death decades earlier meant there would never be a trial, no opportunity to hear him explain his actions, and no formal justice through the court system. The case was officially closed in 2025 as exceptionally cleared due to the death of the suspect. The disturbing element was that Lawless had lived for 8 more years after Marilyn's death, potentially committing other offenses before dying, and had escaped any consequences for what he had done. The case demonstrated both the power of modern DNA technology to solve decades-old crimes and the frustration that comes when perpetrators die before advanced science catches up to them. The next investigation would cross international borders before reaching resolution. Catherine Davio. On May 24, 2008, 33-year-old Catherine Davio was found deceased in her Montreal apartment in Canada. Catherine had been going about her normal activities when she was attacked in her home. The discovery shocked the Montreal community and launched an investigation by the Service de Police de la Ville de Montréal that would span 17 years before reaching resolution. Evidence was collected from the scene, including biological material that was preserved for future analysis. Investigators interviewed neighbors, reviewed security footage from the building and surrounding areas, and explored various theories about who might have been responsible. They examined Catherine's relationships, activities, and anyone who might have had reason to target her. Despite extensive investigation, no suspect was identified in the initial years following her death. The case remained active, but unsolved as years passed. Catherine's family endured over a decade and a half without knowing who had taken her life or why she had been targeted. The investigation periodically received renewed attention as detectives reviewed the evidence and explored new leads. But progress remained elusive until advances in DNA technology provided new opportunities. The breakthrough came in 2025 when genetic genealogy was applied to DNA evidence from the scene. The analysis led investigators to Jacques Bolduc, a man with a criminal history that included robberies and other serious offenses. Further investigation revealed that Bolduc had been active in criminal enterprises throughout his life and had been convicted of various crimes over the years. Investigators worked to build a comprehensive case against Bolduc, gathering additional evidence and documenting his connection to the crime. However, before charges could be filed, they discovered that Bolduc had died in 2021, 4 years before being identified as Catherine's killer. His death from natural causes meant he would never face trial or be held formally accountable for what he had done. Montreal police announced the resolution in 2025, noting that genetic genealogy had definitively identified Bolduc as responsible for Catherine's death 17 years earlier. The announcement brought closure to Catherine's family and answered questions they had carried for nearly 2 decades. However, Bolduc's death 4 years earlier denied them the opportunity to see him face justice in court. The case was officially closed as solved, though exceptionally cleared due to the death of the suspect. The disturbing element was that Bolduc had lived for 13 more years after Catherine's death, potentially committing other offenses during that time before dying and being identified posthumously through advancing DNA technology. The final case would also involve a perpetrator who died before being identified. Christine Gallegos. On May 15, 1985, Christine Gallegos was found deceased near Salt Lake City, Utah, in a location that suggested she had been transported there after being attacked elsewhere. Christine had been hitchhiking to work that day, a common practice at the time for people without reliable transportation. When she failed to arrive at her job and did not return home, her family reported her missing, and a search was launched. The discovery of Christine's body confirmed the worst fears of her family and friends. Evidence was collected from the scene using the forensic methods available in the mid-1980s, including biological material that would later prove crucial to solving the case. Investigators interviewed people who had seen Christine hitchhiking, explored her relationships and activities, and followed various leads. Despite these efforts, no suspect was identified at that time. The case remained unsolved for 4 decades, becoming one of Salt Lake City's longest-running cold cases. Christine's family endured decades without knowing who had taken her life or why she had been targeted. The evidence was carefully preserved in storage, maintained according to proper protocols, with the hope that advancing technology might someday provide answers that were impossible to obtain in 1985. The breakthrough came in 2025, when DNA testing was performed on the preserved evidence and genetic genealogy techniques were applied to identify the perpetrator. The DNA profile was uploaded to genealogy databases and compared against profiles submitted by people researching their family histories. The analysis led investigators to Ricky Lee Stallworth, who had been an Air Force airman stationed in the area at the time of Christine's death. Further investigation revealed details about Stallworth's background and activities. Records showed he had associations that suggested a pattern of behavior, though the full extent of his activities remained unclear. Investigators worked to build a comprehensive picture of his connection to Christine's case and his whereabouts on the day she disappeared. However, before the investigation could be completed or charges filed, investigators discovered that Stallworth had died in 2023 from natural causes. His death came just 2 years before being identified as Christine's killer through genetic genealogy. The timing meant that investigators had been close to solving the case while Stallworth was still alive, but the identification came too late for him to face justice. The Salt Lake City Police Department announced the resolution in 2025, noting that DNA evidence had definitively identified Stallworth as responsible for Christine's death 40 years earlier. The announcement brought closure to Christine's family, who had waited their entire adult lives for answers. They finally knew who had picked up Christine when she was hitchhiking and what had happened to her. The case was officially closed as solved, but exceptionally cleared due to the death of the suspect. For Christine's family, the resolution was bittersweet. While they finally had answers after 4 decades, Stallworth's death 2 years earlier meant there would never be a trial. No opportunity to hear him explain his actions, and no formal justice through prosecution and sentencing. The disturbing element was that Stallworth had lived for 38 more years after Christine's death before dying, having escaped accountability for what he had done, and potentially leaving other cases unsolved.